Can Terence "Bud" Crawford be beaten? After his incredible win over Canelo Alvarez, people are throwing out some absolutely mental statements. And some of them might be true, but I definitely want to assess them in this video. Is he the best ever? Is he better than one Floyd Mayweather? And can he take on and defeat the likes of Dmitry Bivol? In this video, I'm going to cut through all the noise and try and give you a few things that I know to be true about boxing before speculating on how I think Terence Crawford might move through the rest of his career. Do I think Terence Crawford could be beaten? I'll let you know in this video. Hello everyone, and welcome back to A Guy Called Henry. I'm back here in Australia, and as you can see, we've got a little upgrade to the set. Look at that! A Guy Called Henry in bloody neon lights. Unbelievable. It was actually a gift from my sister for emceeing her wedding, which is very nice of her. And I think it looks pretty cool, but let me know what you think of it in the comments, because I think right now, look, I'm going to be in this studio for another 4 months probably, and then I'll be moving. And I think, like, ideally what I'll do is I'll have a wall that's further back in the next one, so you can see the whole thing, and it'll just be a bit smaller. But right now, I think the red light looks pretty cool, and yeah, I'm delighted with it, so thank you very much to my sister for that. Now, I've not really had a chance to make a video because I was traveling back, and I definitely wanted to talk more about Terence Crawford's win over Canelo Alvarez, and the reaction to it in general. After Usyk beat Daniel Dubois, I remember I made a video which was basically, can anybody beat Alexander Usyk? And I want to do something similar here because there's been some fairly outlandish claims about Terence Crawford, about his standing in the all-time boxing list, and about just how far can he go up the weights and who can he actually beat. Because he's gone from being sort of an underdog against Canelo to suddenly being this unbeatable force. And I have a very, very good reason why I'm quite confident he can be beaten, especially by one name that keeps getting mentioned. But I also want to analyze just how good I think he is right now in these divisions and give context to some of the madness, because it has been madness since he won. You know, as soon as a fighter does something incredible like that, we can lose sight of what the context of it was, and I want to put a bit of context back into it. For those of you that are new to the channel, please don't forget to subscribe. We are nearly at 20k now, and I really want to hit it. I'd love to do it before the end of this month. I don't think that's going to be possible, but we are on the march, and we're very nearly there. Do like the video if indeed you do like it, and get in the comments below and let me know, who do you think can beat Terence Crawford, or do you think he's going to go through the rest of his career undefeated? That might be two slightly different questions, to be fair, because he might not fight the people that could potentially beat him. Now, before I jump into, the potential opponents he could be facing moving forward, I think we need to look back a little bit, because it explains a lot, and it explains why I picked Crawford to beat Canelo on points in the first place, and why he was able to do so. Now, some of you may have noticed in the build-up to the fight that I was talking about Terence Crawford quite a bit, and I analysed a number of his fights in talking about the style matchup and the technique and the tactics and how I thought he might be able to beat Canelo Alvarez. And I feel like now that he's beaten Canelo, we've sort of lost context. And again, we've lost a lot of the reason why he was actually able to beat Canelo. The reason for me that he was able to beat Canelo, and the only doubt I ever had over it was size, but the reason he was able to do it was because his style was so horrible for Canelo. It was a very, very difficult style matchup for Canelo to face. It was one that I just felt would be all wrong for him. And for me, as I said in many videos before the fight, what it really came down to for me was how would he manage the size? And in the end, very clear that he managed it extremely well. But there was one fight in particular from Terence Crawford's past that I think was casting the most doubt in people's minds as to whether or not he would be able to beat Canelo. It was against an opponent that not a lot of people knew about, and an opponent that they all thought that Crawford would deal with relative ease. In fact, I was one of them, but maybe for slightly different reasons. And that opponent was Madrimov. And his name came up time and time again by really top boxing pundits. Oh, Crawford struggled against Madrimov. Do we think that that means he's going to struggle against Canelo? Now, aside from the obvious, sort of fact that it might mean he was in decline a little bit, that he struggled with Madrimov, for me, there was a very, very clear reason why he had problems with Madrimov, and it was the outstanding reason why he had problems with Madrimov. And it's why I didn't really consider that fight when I looked at a tactical analysis for facing Canelo. And that is that Madrimov's style in their fight was horrible for Terence Crawford. And it brings us back to the old boxing adage that we've all heard too many damn times. But it almost seems like we need to say it more, because it seems like people just don't hear it, don't grasp it, or they think it's just, made up. It's not a thing. But it's styles make fights. And I know that you hear it so damn often, but it really means something. Different fighters have different ways of going about their business, and different styles match up totally differently. That is why in boxing, it's never a case of boxer A beats boxer B, boxer A loses to boxer C. That means boxer C should surely beat boxer B because he lost to boxer A, but it just doesn't work like that. Because the styles are different, they mesh differently. They have different attributes, different strengths, and different weaknesses. And it's just something that gets overlooked time and time again in boxing. And going into that Madrimov fight, the fact that Crawford won that fight, let's be clear, he won it by a few rounds. I don't remember exactly how I scored it. But the interesting factor about that fight was, yes, it was a horrible style for Crawford, but to give Crawford even more credit for handling that tricky style for him and winning the fight. Madrimov hadn't really shown that style many times in his previous fights. You know, in his previous fights, he was taking a lot more risks. He was a lot more lunging, and he would, traveling from great distance. And it was very similar to the way that Errol Spence went about his business in their fight. And I believe that's why Crawford had picked Madrimov for his first fight at 154 pounds. He was very lunging. He was very reckless. His hands were over the place. And I've got clips where Crawford was even saying, he didn't come in and do all that wild stuff I thought he was going to do.
Israel just was a strong opponent, and we knew that coming in the gate. It was his patience. He was just patient. He was just waiting. He'd feint, and just keep feinting until he get a little closer. So he was real patient in there. He wasn't rushing in with nothing. He wasn't winging those wild winging shots like we normally seen him in the previous fights.
You could hear him saying it there. He didn't believe Madrimov would come in that way. I really think he predicted it would be more like a sort of Errol Spence performance where he would be able to just take his little half steps back and find the counter shots, and I thought he was going to knock him out. I actually predicted that before the fight. And it was a similar thing in this Canelo fight. Now, I never thought he'd knock Canelo out because Canelo is strong, his chin's unbelievable. I didn't really think he'd be able to, put him down, but I just knew I thought he would have enough power to hurt Canelo and keep him off, which is exactly what we saw in the fight. But all of this is to say that people didn't really give Crawford a chance, or a lot of people didn't really give Crawford a chance against Canelo because he struggled with this guy Madrimov, who was 2 weight divisions below Canelo. But it was the style. That is exactly what the problem was. And so this leads us on to the rest of the video, which is, can anybody actually bother Terence Crawford? Will he go and beat everyone because he's now beaten this super champion Canelo at 168 pounds? And again, I'm going to say it again, it's styles make fights. And the thing about size is, yes, it's a factor, but it's only a factor in so much as the guy's got to be good enough to actually use that size. And because of the style matchup in that fight, Canelo wasn't really able to enforce his size on Terence Crawford, because the thing about Canelo at this point is his gas tank isn't great. He's lacking head movement now, and he throws a lot of big singles. He can't really punch while he's moving anymore, and that is a bit of an issue for him. I think the only way you can really beat Terence Crawford is by keeping your front foot to him very close at all times. Madrimov was able to do that because his legs are so athletic. He's got, I talk about this a lot, but Madrimov has some of the best legs in boxing. Honestly, I'm not just talking about aesthetically, I'm talking about what he does with them. The way this guy moves for 12 rounds, it's absolutely incredible. And he doesn't win every fight, but if I'm ever unsure about a pick, I always go for the person with the better legs, typically speaking. And Madrimov, for me, his legs are just absolutely outrageous. The athleticism he has, the stiffness in his legs the day after he boxes must be an absolute joke. But yeah, there's all these calls now for Crawford to, become go and become undisputed in additional weight divisions, because he's managed to do it at 168. People saying drop down to 160 pounds middleweight and unify there, become undisputed there. Back down to 154 and do it. And I think, firstly, I don't believe he's going to be able to do that, Crawford, because the reality of Terence Crawford is, in recent times, since I think for the last 4 or 5 years now, he's fought only once a year. I don't think he has enough time to do it. I really don't, unless I think I heard that the Darmez and Janabek fight could possibly be happening at 160. If they fight and all the belts come together, then potentially he could go down and do it quickly. There's, of course, also Erazlandi Lara to consider, but then maybe you're only looking at 2 fights to undisputed at 160. The issue of all those guys in that division is they just don't have that much commercial pulling power. But it might be that Terence Crawford is big enough now that he could carry those events. I don't know, and that's not really what this video is about. Seeing as we're talking about middleweight, let's start there, as I think that's probably, you'd say, the most natural thing for him to do in terms of going up to 168. What would he do next? Undisputed at 160 sounds like the most realistic thing to do, rather than going back all the way back down to 154. And there's a couple other reasons for that. I'll explain those in a minute. But middleweight being the division below super middleweight, it's less harsh on the body. And that is one thing that has worried me about him going up to 168, is will he have the ability to come back down again safely? Because we've seen it time and time again over the years. If you go up in weight and then you come back down again too fast, it drains and depletes a boxer's ability to take punishment, and the stamina is not the same. And yeah, it can just be really problematic. But in terms of the fighters in that division, they're not that well known, but they're good. Janabek and Adamez are 2 really good fighters. Lara is old now. He's at the end of his career. So I think Crawford will probably quite fancy that one, even though, don't get me wrong, Lara's a brilliant boxer. He's a tricky guy to box, but I would fancy Crawford against Lara. But Janabek and Adamez are much harder to answer because they've just not had enough top-level fights. And they've got that extra size that I think, the fact that they are 2 boxers that are in their primes and are both very, very good, I do think that the 160 size actually would potentially tell a little bit in there. The point I'm trying to make is I don't think just because Crawford's beaten Canelo at a weight division higher that he would necessarily find those fights easier. In fact, I think he'd find fights against Janabek and Adamez harder than a fight against Canelo Alvarez. And you might think that's mental to say because those guys have achieved nothing close to what Canelo has achieved, but you've got to think about the styles. And Janabek is a very, very good technical boxer. Adamez has great come-forward head movement, and head movement is something that is hard to negate. Adama's obviously had a close fight with Hamza Shiraz, and we'll talk about him in a moment too. I definitely thought that he beat Shiraz in that fight. And, that's not an easy fight. And, what I'm trying to say is I don't think it's a given that Crawford could go to middleweight and beat Janibek and Adames. Would I make him favorite? You guys know I don't like to make predictions without studying properly. I really like to sit and look at the tactical styles, the matchups, and really think about it. But just off the top of my head, I would make Crawford the favorite in those fights, but they're difficult fights. They really are tough fights. So it's not a given for me off the bat that he can go down and become undisputed middleweight. And it's risky, It's risky for him because I don't think he'd get the highest paydays there. He hasn't got that long left, and it would just sort of tarnish his career a little bit if he was to lose to one of them now at this point. Before talking about 154, we'll go to where he is at the moment at super middleweight. And I think the thing about this division here is that, as Crawford has said himself, the guys there are absolutely massive. Now, Canelo has beaten all those guys, but I said it in my post-fight reaction video, and I said it before the fight. I think the reason Canelo is at super middleweight, and this is a really important point, so keep this in mind if you haven't heard me say it already. The reason Canelo was at super middleweight was because he preferred it. Even though he was giving up size, even though he was the naturally smaller guy, Canelo is a prodigious talent. He was a very, very good fighter and still is a very, very good fighter. Not what he was exactly, but not a million miles off it. The reason that he's been so good at super middleweight is because he struggles with fighters with fast feet. And most of the guys at 168 are plodders. They don't have that quick foot movement. And it really suited Canelo because he can punch extremely hard for his size and weight. And he's had great defensive skills, great elusive head movement. And basically, he's been able to be in the pocket with them, slip under their shots, throw counter shots. You guys have seen what he does. And the point is that he prefers that to the lighter weights. So that is to say that beating Canelo at that weight doesn't necessarily mean you're going to beat the other 168-pounders, because it depends on how you match up against what they do. For Canelo, it worked well, but for Crawford, it might not. Because some of those guys throw in combinations. Some of those guys are quite big punchers and have fast hands. And sure, their feet aren't super quick, but they might be quicker than Canelo's, or they are quicker than Canelo's, to the point where they're not movers in the way that Crawford could move around the ring. But I do think the foot speed they have could be problematic. And you look at Pacheco and Mbili, even a Munguia. I wonder if a Munguia would be a harder fight than Canelo at this point in their respective careers, even though he'd lost to Sarasa as well. And look, I'd make Crawford a favorite against Munguia, but again, I don't think it's a foregone conclusion. I do think there's a chance there's a fighter out there at 168 that could beat Crawford. And the fighter that I'm really thinking of, and the one that's come up quite a bit, and I mentioned him at the start of my video, is Dmitry Bivol. And there's all this chat now, Bivol against Crawford, why not do Bivol against Crawford? He's only a division higher. He could go up to 175 and he could become undisputed there. I think the first thing to say about that is that I would make Bivol a firm favorite in that fight. I really would. I think that what we talked about, styles make fights, look at the way Israel Madrimov boxes. Bivol is like the super version of what Madrimov does. And he's bigger, much, much bigger. Bivol's foot speed, Bivol's jab, his lead hand, his activity, it's like the complete opposite of fighting a Canelo Alvarez. He's also slightly naturally bigger. Now, interestingly, I do think that Bivol can make 168. He sort of said before that he would be able to come down to 168 for a rematch against Canelo. And so I think if they were to fight, that's the only way it could happen. It would be a super fight at 168. It wouldn't be to become an additional undisputed champion at 175. It would just be, let's make this giant fight. But I would make Bivol the firm favorite, assuming he could make 168 safely and, still be effective at that size. But yeah, in the way that I said that Crawford was all wrong for Canelo, I don't know if you could truly say anyone's all wrong for Crawford because he's so adaptable. But when I think about him in his greatest form, the way he boxes the absolute best, I think that Bivol's probably the hardest style for him to face. And also mixed with the natural size, Crawford said himself that he's not going to fight Bivol. He won't be going up to 175 at least to do it. So for me, I think staying at super middleweight, I don't really see it as an option unless it's people moving up to face him there. And I don't really know what the money fight would be. I mean, maybe a Charlo. I said it after the fight, potentially a Charlo, but do either of them really deserve it at this point? I'm not so sure. Now, going back down to 154, which might be a more natural division for him to go and unify because he's become a world champion there. We know he can perform to a certain level there. What do I think about this division for him? Well, I think it's a division full of killers, and I think out of all these divisions on the list, it's the hardest division with the most depth in it. Serious talent at 154. We've got, Jaron boots Ennis. I think he's a very, very dangerous opponent for Crawford at this point. I'd definitely make Crawford the favorite, but we don't know quite how good Boots is, and I think at 154, we're going to see the absolute best of his talent, the best of his ability, because I do think it's the weight cut when he had the IBF rehydration clause at 147 that was causing him significant problems, and we saw that when he finally unified against Stan Jonas and the rehydration clause for the IBF wasn't in place. He looked like a completely different fighter. He was so supreme. But we've got Vergil Ortiz down there as well. We've got Murtazaliev, Fundora, even Madrimov himself. They had a close fight. It's a dangerous, difficult division. And with the belt so split up, I mean, I've not actually even... So Xander Zayas, I think I've watched him before, is the WBO champion. Murtazaliev is the IBF champion. Fundora is the WBC champion. And Abbas Baru, who I've definitely not watched yet, is the WBA champion. So I wasn't sure if Crawford still held his belt at 154, but clearly he doesn't. And to go back down there and to unify those belts, it would take a while. I just don't think he's got time. So if he wants to become undisputed in another division, that's not the move. If he goes back down there, he's the best guy in that division. I think it's safe to say that. But I do think that a lot of those guys will be very interesting and potentially difficult style matchups for him. They'll be more difficult than a Canelo fight. And I know that sounds crazy to say, but just go and look at the fight with Madrimov if you don't believe me. Long story short, beating Canelo Alvarez doesn't mean that Crawford is unstoppable or unbeatable. Yes, he's one of the best fighters of this division, one of the best fighters ever with his achievements, but it doesn't mean he won't lose before the end if he fights the wrong guy. At the very least, it doesn't mean he won't have a harder fight than that Canelo fight. And to finish this video, do I think that he's better than Floyd Mayweather? Do I think now that he would beat Floyd Mayweather if they were to compete at 147? Well, I think Crawford at 147 is the best Terence Crawford in terms of his attributes, his style, and the strength and power he has at the weight. I think he's probably unbeatable at 147 in this era. It's because he's going up the weight style we're even having this conversation, to be honest with you. But I do think he's an all-time great. I do think he's in the conversation, which is the best you can do because we can't definitively say who beats who in a fantasy match. That's why I really don't like them. I've been asked a few of them recently, and I just, without studying and then without actually getting the chance to see it, I just don't really like going there. But we'll do it at the end of this video anyway. It's definitely a conversation to have whether or not he's better than Floyd Mayweather because he's done it without these rehydration clauses. He's done it. He hasn't really cherry-picked, although I would say, to be fair, to look at Crawford's record, he has fought a lot of guys where it's been the very end of their career at welter. You know, Sean Porter, Amir Khan, Kell Brook, they're all great names, but none of them were in their prime anymore. But Crawford did it so emphatically, and the way he beat Errol Spence as well. Again, he'd had his issues, but again, the way he did it so emphatically, the way he passes the eye test every single time, you have to assume that he's going to do it no matter who he's facing. I do think a fight between him and Mayweather would have been very, very difficult to call. I do keep thinking about Mayweather's speed and defensive acumen. You know, his legs and defensive ability were just absolutely second to none. But Terence Crawford probably has more looks to his game. I think he's probably more adaptable fighter. I think he's a harder puncher at 147 than Floyd was. And we're never going to know who would have won that fight. But the fact we're even talking about it says enough, I think. But guys, I'd love it if you could get in the comments below. Let me know. Who do you think Crawford should fight next? Where should he go? Because people are talking about him ending his career. I said I thought the most likely thing for him to do was to rematch Canelo. And maybe that is the right thing for him to do. I certainly don't want to see him ending his career right now because the form he's in, he's so good still. I'd be really gutted if I never got to watch him fight again. I think the Canelo rematch makes the most sense in many ways because there will be a lot of money on the table, even though it was an emphatic win. You don't need to see it in the sense of it being a contest. I'm not saying it's what I want. I'm just saying it's what I could see happening. I think, and I mentioned him earlier, and I started to talk about him again, the Jaron Boots Ennis fight for me is the one that if Boots can get a move on and fight some big names, you know, get in there quickly against a Vergil Ortiz, a Fundora, any of those guys, get your name out there because that's the fight that could be massive for me, but I just don't know if there's enough time to build it. It's a really disappointing thing, but I just think they've missed each other by a year or two probably. But if it can somehow happen, I would absolutely love, if I could pick any fight out of this list, any of them, Jaron Boots Ennis versus Terence Crawford at 154. It will never be at 147 now, but at 154 would be electric. Even at 160, they could potentially do it at 160 if... All right, let's paint a quick hypothetical. Let's say Yannick and Adames fight and one of them wins, then if one of them could fight Lara, or if in the meantime Crawford can fight Lara, the next fight could be undisputed at middleweight. The paydays won't be quite there. But then imagine like a Vergil Ortiz or a Boots Ennis moving up to 160 to fight him. That'd be fun. That would be really, really fun. But yeah, I'm not ready to see Crawford retire yet. But if he wants to, he absolutely should. I'm just saying that I believe there's so much in the tank still. It would be disappointing not to see him fight more just as a fan. But of course, he should do whatever he wants. Guys, I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, bang a like on it. Don't forget to subscribe if you're new. And as I always say, on to the next one.